I'm Jason Mason and today we'll talk about compression. Compression is probably the best tool that could happen to you when it comes to mixing your song, besides EQing. However, we shouldn't waste that much time and go straight into how to use compression on your tracks and instruments.
Chapter 1. Compressor Settings.
The first and probably the most important chapter in this video. Here are the main compressor settings and knobs you need to use, and let me tell you how.
Threshold.
The threshold is that knob that lets you regulate the level at which the compressor starts to do his work. If you have a silent snare drum, lower the threshold until the LED shows you that something is happening. If your signal is very loud, your threshold doesn't need to be that low.
Ratio.
How much should the compressor do for you? That's what ratio is all about. Once the signal exceeds the threshold of the compressor, the ratio is the knob which changes the amount of compression. On the mix bus, you need, for example, a more soft and low ratio, something between 1.2 and 2.6. Otherwise, on your guitars and drums, you don't need that much dynamics on the signals. So set it up at around 4 to 6, and on the vocals you could totally experiment with the ratio. In my experiences, a higher ratio helps to generate some pressure and powerful vocals.
Attack.
How fast does the compressor attack this signal? That knob sets up, as the word itself says, how quickly the compressor responds. On your snare drum, you could use a more medium-paced attack to keep the fat bass sound. On vocals, to make them spicy, to make them more aggro, set up the attack to a very short number. And on guitars, for example, you can totally experiment around with both settings, as on all the other instruments.
Knee.
It controls the onset of the compressor, how hard he goes into the input signal. A hard knee provides a sudden, more noticeable compression, while a soft knee delivers a smoother, more gradual compression onset.
Release.
The moment when the compressor stops to work. A longer release results in a longer compressed signal, a shorter release the opposite. If you have like a snare sound out of the 80s, you should totally keep all of the gray tail and set up a long release to compress until the snare completely ringed out. The tail of a snare, for your basic music knowledge, is called bleed. Bleed is a great word to describe any instrument that has some kind of reverberation. Some compressors also have an auto-release feature, which adjusts the release time based on the input signal. Pretty convenient.
Makeup gain.
Short description on that one. A knob that regulates the compensation for the gain reduction caused by compression, restoring the overall signal level. Last up,
Sidechain.
Sidechain allows you to use an external signal to control the compression of another track. That knob is pretty useful for tasks like ducking, where one sound reduces in volume in response to another sound. Sidechain is probably mainly used on kick drums and bass guitars to let them both have enough room and to in the end make the mix louder.
Chapter 2. Compressor Types.
So let's talk about the compressor types that are mainly used in the music business all around the world. VCA, voltage controlled amplifier. They are mainly known for their fast response time, versatility and suitability for a wide range of applications. For example, the SSL G-Bus compressor and the DVX 160. VCAs are the compressors I mainly use for my mixing bus, because they sound so goddamn natural and they are pretty amazing in general. Aggressive, powerful and straight up pump, field effect transistor compressors. Fat. They are really aggressive. Mainly used on drums, the fat compressor is perfect for aggressive dynamic work and powerful compressions all the way. Next up, the optical compressors. They offer smooth and transparent compression, often associated with a slower attack and release, which is really great for all kinds of genres on the mixing bus. For example, the Teletronics LA2A is probably the most versatile compressor on this earth. Just put it on your master, and if you didn't completely ruin your rough mix, which is pretty important, your mix will sound like the major ones. And now the warm and fat ones. Tube compressors. Adds warmth, harmonics and coloration to the signal, generally known for a smoother compression style. The mainly is the Fairchild's 10 out of 10. If you have like an old rock production, use those kind of compressors. They are not that cheap, but they are the real deal for any analog recording. Diode bridge compressors, known for adding harmonic distortion and saturation to the signal. One of my absolute favorite compressors is the API 2500. Cool on the drums, perfect on any aggressive, fat, enormous production. You should totally check that one out. Last up, the digital compressors. Precise, flexible, and underrated. Yeah. Absolute. They are still underrated. In the beginning of digital VST plugins around the early 2000s, plugins were, let me say, not that good. One of the big problems was they had mainly the same algorithm, so mostly they sounded all the same. Not that good. But for the last 10 years, plugins became a really good and serious choice for your music production. And now, as you're sitting there in front of your desk, plugin compressors are sometimes at least as good as their analog granddad, and or even sometimes sound better in some kind of way.
As the meme says,
digital compressors are as good as analog ones. Change my mind.
Some final words for you. API 2500, the Teletronics LA2A and the SSL G-Bus compressor are my absolute favorite ones. I produce each week at least 14 instrumentals and 3 to 4 streaming platform songs. And I use at least one of the compressors mentioned above. So if you have money and you want to experiment with your music productions, go to websites like Plugin Alliance or Plugin Boutique and find yourself some nice little compressors. And on those two websites, those compressors are not that expensive. Check them out.
Chapter 3. Dynamic, but not.
Dynamics are your friend. You need to f***ing destroy them. Just a bit. You'll find several videos on YouTube that will tell you about the perfect mixing chain, the perfect vocal plugin for this and that optimal white noise mixing method. However, all the plugins and mixing chains on earth won't help you if you're not able to handle the whole mix right. You need to learn about the right dynamic treatment. Just practice and experiment a lot. End of the story. For example, you have drums with a much too big dynamic range. They'll sound thin, too bassy and undefined. Drums should be compressed really heavy. They need pressure, and you'll get that, for example, with a powerful fat compressor. The cymbals of your drums also should be crushed with your compressor to have this great phenomenon. You'll mix the cymbals relatively quiet, but with the right dynamics, they'll sound much louder. Sounds and feels good? Try it out. If you have a bass guitar, vocals, strings, or even some e-guitars, you need to crush those dynamics too. Your main objective on those is to make them loud with the right compression. If you listen to the biggest songs, especially rock and pop, you'll hear that the guitars and the vocals, for example, are dynamically in the mix, but absolutely not dynamic in itself. Listen carefully. Pink Floyd, Led Zeppelin, Ed Sheeran, or even the Beatles. They've recorded really emotional and powerful guitars. They totally need to be dynamic concerning audio automations. That studio task where you edit the volume of each track manually. It takes a lot of time, but it's totally worth it. But however, they're heavily compressed, and that's how it's supposed to be. If it's less dynamic, it's better to listen to on all loudness levels, on several devices like your phone, in your car, and with the right track dynamics, it's much easier to mix in general. In a nutshell, there ain't a track in your mix which sounds bad if it's recorded properly and the dynamic editing is on point. Sure, there are some kind of preamps for vocals and guitars and drums and whatever, and they're totally worth their price. But for example, last year I saw a video on YouTube where Travis Scott was recording vocals for his album Astroworld in his hotel room, and that's totally fine. Right recording plus perfect dynamic treatment equals a great mix.
Chapter 4. Loudness War and the Aftermath.
You're listening to some music on the radio, you hear a great track from the 80s, and right after that you get to hear a recent release. And that song is much louder, and you wonder why. Since the 80s we are heading to maximum loudness, musically wise. Peaking with the metal album of Metallica, Death Magnetic, released in 2008. It's pretty loud, but it's a 10 out of 10. However, we're now back on the way to a more normal loudness, but yet still pretty loud. One question I asked myself a lot in the past is how loudness is measured. Let me explain that. LUFS. LUFS is the measurement method to check on a song if it is too loud or too silent. I'll make a video about that one later this year. However, with me having a look on the audio analyzer, I can see that those two tracks are completely different loudness wise. Here are the two loudest parts of each song. One of a song that's mixed in the 80s and one of a song mixed a few years ago.
You take my
Long story short, we much more optimize the audibility of each song. LUFS, the measurement method, has just been finally developed in the early 2000s, so that loudness standard wasn't available before. However, if you leave too much room in the mix, your song will be barely audible at low volume.
Chapter 5. Compression Cheat Code.
Once again, there is no cheat code. Yeah, there may be some presets for each guitar, vocal or bass guitar out there, and there are some settings which make a lot of sense. Of course, a slow attack is cool on bass guitars, but let's say you have a metal song, you need a fast attack on the bass guitar. And yes, a long release on guitars is good, but there are totally productions where you need a fast release on the e-guitars. Just experiment with your compressors and what they do to your mix. Sooner or later you will find an optimum way of mixing with those compressors. Long story short, practice. Practice a lot. That's it. I hope you liked my short video about compression. Leave a like if you learned something new today, and please comment me your personal compressor, the one you really like. However, until next time.